Welcome. Wow. You are going to have a fantastic evening tonight. This is one of the most exciting programs we've ever done. I've lost the pedal. One of the things that makes it great is that each of the pieces on this program is a masterpiece, unquestioned masterpiece. And they fit very well together. Now, when you put a concert together, you have to think about how the pieces work. Unlike a radio station like CRB, they just put anything on and it doesn't have any connection. But in a concert, you really want the pieces to speak to each other. And these pieces speak powerfully to each other. One of the interesting things is that they're all written at exactly the same time. Between 1945 and 1953. Two of the pieces were written in 1945 and one of them in 1953, and that's just a tiny moment in music history. And it's often very interesting to look at different pieces from different perspectives that were written at the same time. Jeremy Eichler has just written a book which takes 4 composers all writing around the time of the Holocaust, and it's so fascinating how those intertwine with each other and illuminate each other. So you're going to find some things that illuminate each other. 2 of the pieces are very closely connected, the Britten at the beginning and the Shostakovich at the end, because they both describe or present individuals hounded by society in different situations. Enclosed communities which create tension with the individual, one against the crowd. Now, the concerto, by definition, sets up that tension of one against the crowd. So the romantic concertos all do that. But it would be appalling to have a Rachmaninoff concerto or some big Tchaikovsky or something like that between these 2 pieces. They have to have something that's totally contrasted. And the Bartok is totally contrasted. It doesn't have any of that conflict. It's the opposite. It's genial, it's tender, it's loving, and it creates solace between these 2 frighteningly intense pieces of music. It's really a solace for the soul, I think, of the Bartok. So beautiful. I just want to say a word about the space in which we are in. Some people who come to these concerts are doing so for the first time, and the power of the sound in this room is part of what the music is about. So the last time we did the Shostakovich 10th, which was 20 years ago, we did it in a much, much smaller space, and it was too overwhelming. It was almost an affront or an attack. This has to fill out the space completely so that you are overwhelmed by the experience, but it still needs a certain space in order to contain the impact and the physicality of this music. And Shostakovich needs the acoustic of Symphony Hall for the demands of the music, which are great, great, great demands are put on the orchestra and also on the audience. Now, the Britten is very short. It's 7 minutes long, and it is a short moment in the opera Peter Grimes, which is probably the greatest opera ever written in England and one of the greatest ever in the 20th century. It's the cornerstone of English opera. And it takes place in a small village like Aldborough, which is where Benjamin Britten lived and where, incidentally, in my youth, I and the family, my sister is up there, my brothers are looking in England, and we spent our youth in Aldborough in order that I could be close to Benjamin Britten in those early stages. I was 9, 10, 11 years old. So I know that part of the world very, very well. Britten was steeped in the sea. His house was right up against the sea. He could hear it in his music. And so he came across this poem by George Crabbe, which tells a story about this fisherman, Peter Grimes. In the original poem, he was a complete villain without any redeeming features at all. But in the opera, he's a much more complex character. He's a bully. He treats people badly. But he's also an idealist. He's not an evil person. He's an idealist. He wants to marry the school teacher, the Ellen Orford, who was a widow, and he loved her greatly, but he has to earn money because he doesn't have any money. He can't marry her until he does. And so he drives himself mercilessly in his work as a fisherman, and he drives his apprentices mercilessly. And unfortunately, mysteriously, one of them died. And in accidental circumstances, that's a phrase that comes in the opera, accidental circumstances. And there's a kind of a trial. It's not a real trial, it's in the Moot Hall in Aldborough, which you can still see. It's a beautiful place. And the villagers gathered together, and they decided the evidence was inconclusive, but they were muttering amongst themselves about this man. And one of them said, don't get another boy, get a grown-up who can speak up to you. But he doesn't take any notice. He gets another boy, and storms gather. And as you probably gather, there's a big storm in this. In the next concert of the Boston Philharmonic Youth Orchestra, we're going to play the 4 sea interludes, which also come from Peter Grimes, in which that storm is represented in the most powerful way. One Sunday, she notices the boy has bruises and his jerkin is torn, and it's beginning again. Grimes is at his exercise. Unfortunately, the boy falls to his death, and there's a witch hunt. Grimes is actually not guilty, but it's too much for the community, and so the community closes in on him, and Ellen says, we failed. And he's so upset that he strikes her, and so be it, may God have mercy upon me. And at that moment, he uses 7 notes to sing that. Those are the 7 notes that he uses. And then what Britten does is he takes those 7 notes and makes a PASSACAGLIA, which is a piece with a bass that repeats itself over and over and over again. And it's written in a very strange way because it appears on this beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. So it's actually 11 beats that are played. And it is repeated 38 times. And over that, there is a whole set of variations. And the first thing that happens is that the viola solo, the first violist, plays a very beautiful melody. And as you notice, that's just a falling fifth. That's all it is. And she, I think, represents that hope, that vision, that maybe longing for companionship or whatever the emotion is. You'll find your own way of deciding. What's interesting about it is it goes up very high, out of the range of the viola. So it seems to suggest that his dream is an impossible dream. It'll never happen. And then the piece gets louder and louder and more violent, and the intervals of seconds are everywhere, and it becomes almost unbearable in its intensity. It's like a scream of pain. By the end, it's really at that level where we can barely just bear it, and there's an enormous crash with the percussion playing as loud as they can, tam-tam and bass drum. And then out of that noise comes the delicate sound of the celeste, which is bells. And the solo viola now plays again. And what's happened now is that Peter Grimes has gone mad. His mind has become unhinged. And he goes from a madman, from a visionary to a madman in the course of the piece. Now, the amazing thing is that there's nobody on stage during this entire thing. He doesn't sing about it. The stage is empty, and it's all happening in his head, and therefore in our head. So it's an extraordinary gesture. It's a brilliant idea. Nothing on stage. And one way of listening, and I don't want to interfere, but one way of listening is to take something that, from your own experience, that you consider a catastrophe that you can't live with, and bring it into your own head while you're listening. And that could make it a very powerful and very intense experience, which is what 7 minutes. I've just described 7 minutes of music. The Shostakovich is 50 minutes of music, so we better get on. The Bartok concerto. I just want to say a word about our soloist, who I love. Ben Hochman has never been in this building before. And he comes from Israel, lives in Berlin, and he's a wonderful musician. And when he walked in, he said, it's like a temple. And it is like a temple. You know, for musicians all over the world, this is a mecca, this is a center, this is one of the great music spaces in the entire world, and he was in awe and thrilled. Now, the Bartok I'm going to talk about very, very briefly, because in a way it doesn't need talking about. It's very interesting. It's serene and weightless. It's so light compared to the Britten and the Shostakovich. It weaves melodies which thread over this transparent orchestral texture. You hear every note. There's no struggle. It's lucid, it's lyrical, it's gracious, liquid in its flow, very Hungarian. Bartok was steeped in Hungarian folk music, and you can hear that. And I could play you a little bit of it, but I don't think I will, because you'd be much better off hearing him play. But the thing is, it is full of wonderful rhythms, and but I will talk a little bit about the second movement. What happened was he suffered from leukemia, and this was the last piece he composed, and he didn't finish the last 17 bars. He was writing it on the day he died. It was a gift to his wife, Dita, who he loved, who was a former student and a pianist. He wanted to give her something that could give her income, because he had no money to leave her. And so he left her this piece. And she didn't play it for a long time, but eventually she did. And in the second movement, he does something extremely touching. He was visiting in Saranac, already ill, very ill, but he had a reprieve from his disease, and he got quite hopeful that he would be able to recover, which was undoubtedly wishful thinking, but he felt that. And so what he did was he quoted from Beethoven's Opus 132 string quartet in A minor, which is in the Lydian mode, which that anybody who knows that quartet, I only need to play 2 chords, and you say, oh, that's the Beethoven Lydian mode. And that's the beauty of classical music, is because we know these pieces and love them and get to know them, and the counter references are so satisfying and so beautiful. And so the strings do this kind of chorale, and the Beethoven called it sacred song of thanksgiving to the deity from a convalescent. And so it's a kind of touching thing that Bartok took that, and of course seen through a 20th century viewpoint. In other words, there are few notes that wouldn't belong in Beethoven, you can imagine. But it's very, very beautiful. And then comes a section which is exquisite and fascinating. Bartok was fascinating by the night and by the sounds of the night. And comes a section now that is full of bird calls. And what happened apparently, that this was the previous year, they were visiting a retreat in North Carolina, and he recorded the bird calls. He spent his whole life recording folk music. He was the most knowledgeable on the subject of folk music of anybody in the world. And now he also turns out he was very knowledgeable about birds. And some people have actually been able to identify the actual birds which are in this music. And so it's a great moment, and then it ends again with the chorale, and it's exquisitely beautiful. I mean, you can't find more beautiful music than that. And the finale is very Hungarian, and with the rhythm da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and it's very contrapuntal. There's a fugue, and it's very exciting, and it's very easy to enjoy. So you don't have to worry about it at all. On the other hand, when we get to the Shostakovich, you have to start worrying, because we know what the PASSACAGLIA is about, because it's an opera, we know the story. We don't need to know what the Bartok is about, because it's such beautiful music and so easy to listen to. But with the Shostakovich, it's more difficult, because there is no name to it. It's not called the Leningrad or the Baba Yar or anything of the kind, and there's no program. In fact, when Shostakovich was asked, what is it about, he said, let them listen and guess for themselves. So he didn't want you to know, he wanted you to guess. Well, we do want to know, and there are some clues, and I want to tell you some of the clues. One is that Stalin had just died. March 1953, Stalin died, and Shostakovich must have been incredibly relieved when that day happened, if not overjoyed. The other thing that he said was that the second movement is a portrait of Stalin, as well as other things. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So he had been designated at that point as an enemy of the people, and I think we're getting a sense of what that might mean, although we can't possibly guess what it really meant. He never recovered from that attack that Stalin made about the Lady Macbeth opera. Probably many of you know that story. It was devastating, and he was completely ostracized. He was in fear of his life, and he disappeared behind a face mask. The story is, which I always find incredibly touching, is that he literally used every night after dinner, he would put on his overcoat with a packed suitcase, sitting by the door waiting for the secret police to come and get him, because he didn't want the children to be woken. Now, I have my wonderful Joey there, who's 12 years old and plays in my youth orchestra. Thank you for your passion, Joey. I love it. But imagine what it is for a 12-year-old living in America to hear such stories and to experience what he's about to hear. It's going to be overwhelming. One of the statements I came across today as I was looking is somebody made the statement, Soviet art can have no other aim than the interests of the people and the state. That's how Shostakovich had to live. And so what he wanted to do was portray human emotion and passions, and that's what he did. But it was always behind a mask, so there's always more than one thing being expressed. So if it sounds triumphant, you can be almost certain that it isn't, and so on. So every note for this composer had meaning. For Russians, had meaning. I'm going to share with you a very exciting thing which has happened to me, which is I'm going on Monday to Berlin to make a program which apparently everybody in Russia who thinks and feels watches, from 7 to 14 million people. And it's an opportunity to speak about these things with the Russian people right now, which I'm kind of awed by and thrilled, and we're going to have recordings and the classes, and it's going to be really an amazing thing. So I heard that one of my Russian friends, she said, everybody listens to that program. So that's how Putin does too. Okay, so let me tell you how this works. It starts with a very ominous figure. That's it. And then there's a pause, like those Eisenstein movies, you know, where people kind of pause and wait. It could be the opening of a Russian novel. It sounds very unimportant, doesn't it? Well, so does this. Right. Because if you listen carefully, that figure permeates this entire symphony. If you're really paying attention, you'll hear it all the time, all the way through it. And what's also important is that interval. And it's dark and Russian. That's all I can say. It's just Russian. Everything about it is Russian. It feels, and I just tell them, play like Rostropovich, and immediately they play like this. They know exactly what that is. Brooding, it's a brooding, wandering, dark, troubled world. And now a clarinet comes in, and the clarinet goes like this. Sorry, wrong note. Now, if you know your Mahler, and many people do know their Mahler, in the second symphony, der Mensch liegt in größter Not. You remember that? Well, he just took that and made it the theme for the clarinet. Now, if you know Mahler and you're listening to this, and that brings all of Mahler along with it. That's the wonderful thing about this music and about our culture, that we have these things in common. It's so thrilling. And it's an exact quote. And gradually it builds up to the first great climax in the piece. And it's big, it's enormous, the orchestra is huge, it takes a long time to get there, and it's like going up a mountain. You reach a ledge and you think, we got here. But of course you know there's a long way to go. Right? But by playing that music at that intensity, we now know the size of the thing, what to expect. And we're on a great mountain journey. And then there's a valley. And what happens in the valley is a beautiful little waltz that happens very Mahlerian, and I've taught them to play it like Mahler, with that kind of freedom that Mahler has, because Shostakovich would have loved that. And it's on the flute, and the flute is very low, so it sounds vulnerable and a little bit, vulnerable, a little bit hurt. And it builds up from there, always with that rising da-da-dee, da-da-da. And at the same time, the horns are going da-da-da, coming down in the opposite direction. It's overwhelming. And now you'll get the sense of what this power of this orchestra is, and the power of the music. It is just overwhelming. And it's thrilling. It's absolutely thrilling. And as you get higher and higher, it's like climbing a mountain. The wind is more and more ferocious, and the cold just hits you. It's a psychological gale that we go through at that point. And then once it's happened, it's got to come down. It comes down the other side, like going down a mountain. And it's the opposite direction. And when you get to that little waltz of the flutes, it's two clarinets, but singing now super soft, very beautiful in thirds. they're like an oasis on the way down. And then we get lower and lower, and then something really extraordinary happens, which is that there's a recapitulation of the opening right at the end. And if you're listening carefully, you say, oh my God, this is the recapitulation. We must have a whole lot more to go. No, it's only another 2 minutes, because he puts it right at the end, which is very original. And then 2 piccolos are left in the top together. Complete desolation. And you're left with a sense of absolute exhaustion and fear and what the Germans called erspannt, just everything has been given. That takes 25 minutes. That is half the length of the symphony, is the first movement. Now, why is it so long? Well, it's so long because the journey is big. And if you give yourself over to it and don't keep saying to yourself, why, this is really going on awfully long. And haven't we heard this before? No. But just give yourself over to the length as if you were climbing a mountain emotionally. And you won't find it long at all. Every moment is extraordinary. There isn't one wrong note or bad moment or dull moment in the entire thing. So the picture of desolation you will feel physically. And I think if you ask yourself, could I get up and walk out? You'd probably say, no, I can't. And then what happens next is absolutely stunning. It's the second movement is truly astonishing. There's no other word for it. It's a piece that lasts for 4 minutes. That's all. 4 minutes. If you play it at the correct tempo, that's what it lasts, 4 minutes. And it is the most compressed movement virtually in the whole symphonic repertoire. It is both exhilarating and devastating and ferocious and terrifying and savage, and it's supposed to be that portrait of Stalin, or at least of the evil which he brought into the world and which he perpetrated on other human beings. Interestingly enough, very few people do it at the tempo which Shostakovich marked it to be played. Even our revered Boston Symphony, we all look up to as one of the greatest orchestras in the world, in their recording, which won the Grammys a few years ago, they don't do it at the tempo. They do it quite a bit under, and most people do it under the tempo. You will hear it tonight at the tempo at which Shostakovich urges. Now, there are a few people in the orchestra who wish that we weren't, because it's extremely hard, and it puts an unreasonable pressure on them, not only technically, but also emotionally. But we're going to do it. There's a wonderful phrase which came from Arthur Schnabel, the great pianist. He said, safety last. So the whole piece is loud from beginning to end, except for one passage. Shostakovich himself wondered if it was too short. I think, of course, he was being ironic, but he did say, isn't it too short? The answer is no, because it's as long as it's possible to be with only one idea. There's no contrasting music. There's no second theme, to give a little relaxation, a little song. No, nothing. From beginning to end. It is, it's no A, B, A. This is just A. And it'll hit you in the solar plexus. 4 minutes, inexorable, merciless. And when it ends, you feel you've been battered by it. And if you think I'm exaggerating, because some people say occasionally I exaggerate, I don't think you'll think I'm exaggerating when you experience this. If you've never experienced it, and particularly in this hall, with this orchestra at that tempo, you're going to be battered. Okay, you'll understand what Shostakovich was up against. Okay. Third movement. It's interesting. It's a kind of a quasi-scherzo. Part comic, part pathetic, ambiguous. We don't really know what the rhythm is. And where are the beats? What's going on? It's off kilter. It's strange. And however, what we have for the first time in Shostakovich's output, an amazing discovery. If you play a D and an E flat and a C and a B, you get Shostakovich's name. D, S in Germany, ES, S meaning E flat, C, and H, which is B in German. Now, in order that you can say to your grandchildren that you sang in Symphony Hall, could we just sing that together? Let's do it one more time because it was so beautiful. Now, amazingly enough, when that appears, you're going to say, oh my God, that's Shostakovich. Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's totally astonishing. You're, oh, he's there. All right, so that's what happens. And it happens for the first time in this piece. It then goes on being used lots of other places. Interestingly enough, the opening, if I translate that into the same notes, the opening of the piece, you remember? You remember that? It's really kind of the same thing. So when you get to that moment, it feels as though we've been there already. So it isn't a surprise. It's a wonderfully ingenious idea. Makes the whole thing feel completely organic. And then comes a very interesting and slightly bewildering thing. There's a horn call, like a summons. Strange, where does that come from, and why does it come? And we don't actually know what it means, but it is possibly, it's been suggested, a woman that he was in love with, and I have no reason to believe that's not true, but it is somewhat mysterious, particularly since it comes 11 times, and always in the same way with the same notes. So you'll make of that whatever you make. One of the things it might be worth knowing is that when Shostakovich wrote the Ninth Symphony, his Ninth Symphony, he angered Stalin because it should have been an ode to joy about the Soviet state. And instead, it gave joy to the people because it was a very lightweight, kind of Haydn-esque symphony. So when he came to do the 10th, all right, so that's that. Fourth movement. The fourth movement, the third movement ends very high with flute and piccolos up very high. And now we go down into the depths. So if you're thinking in terms of color, you've got very high notes, very low notes. You've got the whole color spectrum of sound, which Shostakovich is really master of. And he can make an orchestra sound like no other composer. It's just absolutely amazing. Again, particularly in this hall, we're very thrilled. We've rehearsed here, but when this place is empty, it doesn't sound good because it's too resonant. And they used to have a curtain when there was a rehearsal. It went across the whole thing. Every time they had a rehearsal, they would pull the curtain. And then the fire department came in and said they couldn't do that anymore. So we still haven't heard it, but we'll hear it tonight because you're here and other people will be here, and that'll make the acoustics absolutely perfect. And now we go into the dark world of the cello and bass, like the beginning of the piece. And comes a very amazing section in which 3 wind instruments improvise, give the feeling of improvisation. First the oboe, And I don't think you'll ever hear this oboe solo played more beautifully than Peggy Pearson plays it. I've never heard it played as beautifully as she does it. It's absolutely heartbreaking and incredibly expressive. And then comes the flute, and then the bassoon. And it's almost like an Eastern lament. It has a kind of a hypnotic quality to it. And then it seems as though it's searching for a theme. Bum, ba-bee, bum, ba-bee. Like the Beethoven Ninth, the last movement. Let's come up with a theme here. Searches, and then suddenly they find the theme. Bum, ba-dee, bum, ba, it's a very cheerful, kind of light-hearted, Haydn-esque kind of theme. Starting off with the clarinet, with lots of runs all over the place, and very cheerful. And maybe that was the intention of this movement. I don't think so. I think that it may appear on the surface to be cheerful, rejoicing, but I think it's too fast to be simply rejoicing. And again, there's a tempo marking, and it's identical to the second movement. There cannot be a coincidence. So this last movement is going to be played again very fast. And if you play even a very cheerful piece very fast, there is a feeling of being hunted, as though something's at the back here all the time, relentlessly going forward. But it has all the elements of a finale, of a cheerful finale. What I think is happening here is that Shostakovich is passionately declaring his right to be in a society that demands that everybody has to conform, to surrender their individuality. And why we know that, because we keep on hearing over and over and over and over and over again. And finally, at the end, it gets faster and faster. And finally, the timpani, bum, 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 on the timpani, the whole thing is, it goes completely crazy. Not mad, crazy. And so I think he's saying, I am Dmitri Shostakovich, I am Dmitri, I am Dmitri. And it has really a tremendous power and courage, and he's defiantly proclaiming his artistic identity, and it's a very powerful and extraordinary thing to experience. Because Stalin is dead, so he's no longer forced to create anonymous, socialist, realistic music. So I think that's what he is telling us there. And he's telling this story all the way through the symphony in many different ways. And the more we bring to the experience of listening from our own experience, the more we'll get out of it. So bring everything you have, everything you've experienced, politically, emotionally, literarily, musically, just bring it all, and you will find an enormous experience to be had here in this piece. Now, I want to say one more thing on the opposite side of it, which is, never mind, it doesn't matter. So this is such powerful music and so beautiful that you will love it and experience it as music. You don't need to know all the stories and all the things that I've told you, because it sounds on its own terms. The way it works is that it takes material like those kind of little phrases, and constantly transforms them into something else, like plastic, and it moves gradually through the transformation of material, not by overt contrast, which is what traditional composers do. They do one theme, and they do a contrasting theme, and then they may develop it, and then they come back and do it again. It's not like that. It's constantly developing. And we follow, for instance, in the first movement, the curve of tension as it goes up to the height and then comes down again, or goes up to the first ridge and then goes up to the top and comes down. And you don't need to explain it. It's an emotional experience, whatever you're thinking or feeling. So I have one last thing to say about this experience, which is that I've rarely experienced in my life so much joy, devotion, and passion from the players about this piece. They are in love with it, every one of them. They just adore to play it. So it's from heart to heart, and I know that you will love it. Thank you. We are dedicating tonight's concert to the memory of Ros Xander, who passed away suddenly and unexpectedly this September. We are doing so because of the profound influence and effect she had on this institution. She and her husband, Hans-Jörg Wies, have been far and away the biggest supporters. With their support, without their support, we would certainly not have been able to realize our artistic dreams and perhaps not even continue to exist. But we are doing so today because Ros had been the inspiration and spiritual guide of the BPO since its beginning 45 years ago. Ros loved this orchestra and has attended every concert. Even when there were 3 in a weekend, she came to all of them. In recent years, in this hall, members could look up and see her radiant, enthusiastic face shining down on them from the first balcony. So many of the people on this stage have stories of their special bond with her. Every member of the Boston Philharmonic Youth Orchestra has been profoundly affected by her teaching since that orchestra was founded 12 years ago. Some have even reported that her guidance in the practices of possibility is the most lasting effect of membership in that orchestra. She was always able to coax harmony amidst the discords of life and give buoyancy to what is stuck. Personally, when I face difficulty, the light dims, it goes dark. She was always able to help me see the light, even in my own darkest times. Tonight's program is full of dark music, and therefore may not seem an appropriate way to celebrate such a radiant and optimistic being, but it is not so. As the family therapist she was, she would have understood and embraced Peter Grimes's terror and isolation, and would have been able to offer the solace of her wisdom and warmth. She fully understood the dangers of authoritarianism, which she and Hans-Jörg have fought against so fiercely. She loved Shostakovich's courage in facing down with his powerful and beautiful music the cruel tyranny of Stalin's dictatorship. In every part of her life, Ros embodied the independence of the human spirit. And I think she would have greatly appreciated the gracious and light-hearted Bartok piano concerto, which stands between the two dark works on this program. This concerto was a gift of love from the dying composer to his beloved wife. Especially Ros would have related to the ineffable prayer of thanks in the second movement with its echoes of the Beethoven late quartet, which she loved. And then in the extraordinary depiction of nature with its strange bird calls and sounds of insects, a world Ros inhabited not as a guest, but as a full participant. Nature was her habitat, as her glorious landscape paintings demonstrate. Ros's greatest gift was her ability to connect, to unite, and include all living things. She was able to bind together strands that could fall apart without her gentle guiding hand. It is just such binding together that music does best. We remember her tonight with deep gratitude.
much. I would like to play a little Bach.
I have one thing to add. Many of you don't know who this Ros Xander is. So I want to tell you a little story. And maybe it will help you understand why all these people are so moved by her. One day, a couple came to see her from New York. They were having trouble with their marriage. And they drove up from New York, and they settled down in her office and waited for a long time, and then more. And they realized after a while that she wasn't coming. She was in Colorado, double booked. So they were a little irritated. Many hours of driving and wasted time. And then one of them said, "What would Ros say if she were here?" And then they started discussing that. And when they left, 2 hours later, they left a check for the full amount of the session. Now, all we have is, what would Ros say? And we think about that a lot. And in the youth orchestra, each week I hand out one of her assignments, which she gave each week for the 12 years that she was overseeing that organization. And I've just kept on giving them out. And this week, I had a little question. I wasn't sure which one to hand out. So I thought I would tell you the 3 that I decided on. And you can choose which one you like. Dare to dream, because dreaming is a part of planning. The second one was, throw yourself into life like a pebble into a pond and watch the ripples. And the third one was, create an environment of love and walk into it. Well, I decided to give them dare to dream, because dreaming is part of planning. And next week and the other, I'll give the others. And when we go on tour in June, we always give the same assignment. Walk with spirit and love. And these young people walk with spirit and love. And Ros always said, death is not a tragedy. It sounded good then. I'm not so sure now. But what she meant was that life is continuous. We go on. We keep the conversation going. And that's what we're all going to do. And when we say goodbye at the end of each year in the youth orchestra, we always play the same piece, Nimrod. It's our way of saying goodbye to each other after sometime years together in the orchestra. When we go on tour at the end of every concert, we play Nimrod as a way of saying goodbye. Now, this piece is often played at funerals, but it's nothing to do with death. It's to do with friendship and with love. And Ros embodied that totally. I always think Ros is Nimrod. And so we're going to play Nimrod. We're going to steal it from the youth orchestra. Many of them are here and watching. And we're going to play that piece not because of the death, but because of the life, because of the contribution, because of the continuing giving of love on love on love. And that is the secret of Ros's life. And so now we play Farewell with Love.